The Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is a conflict that you may be aware has flared up in a big way over the last couple of weeks. It's a conflict that has been going on for more than 70 years, and it's over lands claimed by two different groups of people. The Palestinians, who have lived in these lands for thousands of years, and those of Jewish descent, the Israelis, who have more recently returned to these lands. Israel, the modern-day state, was created by the United Nations in 1948. Most Jewish people who live in these lands have arrived since modern-day Israel was created. But historically, Jewish people have long claimed these lands as their traditional homelands too. It's where the Jewish religion began. And it's where many of the stories of their ancestors originate. But let's unpack that all a little before we get into talking about what's happening specifically today. To start us off, let's find Israel and Palestine on the map. These are lands in the west of Asia, in a region that is often called the Middle East. Israel and Palestine are surrounded by countries whose majority populations are Arab Muslim, including Egypt to the southwest, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon immediately surrounding, as well as countries like Saudi Arabia to the south and Iraq to the north, in relative proximity too. Like their neighbor Palestine, the populations of these lands are predominantly of Arab Muslim descent, contrasting with the mainly Jewish and often of European descent people of Israel. In this largely Arab region of the world, Israel is effectively the largest military power, and they are surrounded by nations that they don't really have a lot in common with. This sets the scene for potential hostility. And across recent history, Israel has seen plenty, although generally speaking, they have come out on top. Israel and Palestine hold a special importance within world history. These are not just the lands where Judaism began. Christianity too also emerged here, and they are of enormous significance for followers of Islam too. Islam, like Judaism and Christianity, is often referred to as an Abrahamic religion, Abraham being a key prophet across all three faiths. And many of the same figures appear across the holy books of all three religions too. Judaism was the first to emerge in these lands, around 900 BC, so almost 3,000 years ago. Christianity came next, about 900 years later, or about 2,000 years ago. And Islam, the religion of Muslim people, began around 600 years later again. When Islam emerged at Mecca, in the modern-day land of what we call Saudi Arabia today, just below the modern-day state of Israel or Palestine, what you want to imagine is the absolute explosion of the Muslim faith across the Middle East, and much further beyond too. People across these lands rapidly converted to Islam. That included in the lands once called Israel or Judah, the traditional homelands of Jews and Christians as well. So that was all way back in history. The Palestinian people, Arab Muslims, have been living in these lands for thousands of years. But then in the 20th century, a really big world event happened, World War II. Occurring between 1939 and 1945, this was the worst war the world had ever seen. Although there is still some debate around exactly how many people died as a consequence of this conflict, common estimates are between 75 and 85 million people. These were wars of aggression. The Nazis, for example, alongside their allies, Italy and Japan, became busy invading their neighbors. War crimes on a horrific scale were committed on all sides. But perhaps most horrifically was the systemic persecution of Jewish people by the Nazis, as part of an era of history now referred to as the Holocaust. This is where European Jewish people, 6 million in total, were murdered, simply because they were Jews. Jewish people were blamed for the hardships experienced by Germany, and they were scapegoated by Germany's then leader, Adolf Hitler, in his pursuit of power and dominance across Europe. Concentration camps were set up across Germany as well as in countries occupied by the Nazis. This included infamous places, like Auschwitz in Poland, where 1.1 million of the approximately 6 million Jewish people murdered as part of the Holocaust died in the gas chambers here. It was a horrific period of history. Jewish people, as you would expect, were enormously traumatized by the events of the Holocaust. Important to note too, is that they had already experienced persecution across Europe and beyond, prior to the war itself. The Holocaust, as extreme as it was really just the final straw. Momentum began to create a Jewish homeland, a place where Jewish people could be together and could feel safe. Long claimed as their traditional homelands anyway, this is how the modern-day state of Israel came to be. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. Now, the British are part of this next bit too. Across a few centuries leading up to World War II, Britain had become the dominant world power, colonizing and conquering across the world, and helping to shape a lot of the world geography that we see on our world maps today. Britain was in the business of making of money, lots of it, and control of the Middle East, beginning with efforts in the 19th century and continuing across the first half of the 20th century, meant that Britain also gained control of an economically significant route, that from Europe to India. India already being one of Britain's most profitable colonies. And as part of this, after World War I, the British formally took control of Palestine. This meant that following the awful events of World War II, Britain was strategically placed to gift Palestinian lands, from which the modern-day state of Israel could be created. This was recognized by the international community as a whole, when the newly formed United Nations passed a resolution recognizing the creation of two states, one Arab and one Jewish, out of the British Mandate of Palestine. Jewish people, long persecuted in Europe and with many from their communities lost during the Holocaust, then began flooding into this newly created state. Naturally, Palestine's people were outraged. The Israelis were declared colonial occupiers. Violence between Jewish settlers and Palestinians quickly escalated, with both sides arming themselves. On the left is what the map of Palestine looked like before the modern-day state of Israel was created. Moving to the right, you can see that Palestinian lands were carved up to create space for Israel's people. So that today, we can see that Israel occupies most formerly Palestinian-held lands. Basically what happened is that following the formal withdrawal of the British, a war, the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, began. Palestine was initially supported by their Arab Muslim neighbors. States including Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon all rushed to aid Palestine, declaring war on the new Israeli state. Israel, a product of the world's international powers, counted among its allies many of the world's Western powers, including the United States and Britain. The Israelis won that first war, the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, and there has been no peace since, with Israel encroaching ever further into and across Palestinian lands. So in 1967, for example, a new rise in the fighting occurred. Often referred to as the Six-Day War, because of how decisively Israel crippled Arab forces. The outcome of that conflict too was that Israel then found itself in control of the previously Palestinian-held lands of the Gaza Strip, a small and important piece of land near Egypt. And Israel also came to occupy another important piece of Palestinian land too, the West Bank of the Jordan River. Take note of those names, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. They are the two main areas of Palestinian territory left to the Palestinians today, although they are still under Israeli control. Crucially, during the 1967 conflict too, Israeli seized the Sinai, a large chunk of Egypt's eastern territory, which Israel held until 1982, and which, following its return to Egypt, set the scene for peace between Israel and Egypt, with Egypt cooperating with and essentially partnering with Israel on important matters ever since. Among other Arab neighbors, Saudi Arabia too has become strategically allied with the United States, also one of Israel's key allies. The U.S. currently provides Israel with approximately $3.3 billion in annual foreign military financing. And while Saudi Arabia is still ostensibly on the side of the Palestinians, the practical reality of this is generally less than seen. So the Palestinians have been left with few allies, even among those neighboring states with whom they generally share a lot in common. There have been other conflicts since 1967 too, including in 1973, where Israel came to control yet more lands. Ultimately, there have been no formal or lasting resolutions to these conflicts. While Israel continues to maintain that they are only defending their right to exist in these territories, conditions in the few remaining Palestinian territories have grown progressively worse. Today, Israel has a very large standing army and air force, which they utilize forcefully to maintain their hold over the region. They have extensive weapons systems, including a missile defense shield, referred to as their Iron Dome. This means few rockets fired from Palestinian territories make it into Israeli ones. So when conflict breaks out between Israel and Palestine today, while Israel generally suffers few casualties, the consequences for Palestine, by contrast, are extreme. Today, Palestine is essentially an open-air prison. The people of Palestine have little control over any of the lands that were once theirs. Palestinian people are largely confined to two main areas, which formally remain under Israeli control. As mentioned earlier, these are the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. They are areas that are today surrounded by barbed wire, as well as heavily policed by Israeli soldiers. Palestinian people must seek permission from Israel to move between their designated areas, with permission often refused. The flow of goods is also heavily restricted, with power blackouts a daily reality. Alongside this are often severe shortages of necessary items, including food, water, and medical supplies. Palestinian economies have been crippled, and unemployment is extremely high. Palestine did establish an army in 1964. The Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, was created with the purpose of establishing the liberation of Palestine through armed struggle. In 1987, a more radical faction was then also formed in Palestine. Called Hamas, this is a faction that has its origins in Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood movement, which had been active in the Gaza Strip since the 1950s. Following uprisings and attacks by Hamas against Israeli settlers through the 1990s and into the 2000s, this led to Hamas coming to be considered by Israel and their allies to be a terrorist organization. Hamas has legitimately been elected to power in Palestine, though. In 1994, for example, a governing body known as the Palestinian Authority was established. This followed U.S.-led peace talks in the early 1990s and occurred with the agreement of Israel. Following significant internal dissension among Palestinian groups and coming alongside Hamas' formal election to power in 2006, Hamas then came to control the Palestinian Authority. Today, Hamas continues to control the Palestinian Authority in the Gaza Strip. But another faction, known as Fatah, whose origins are found in the Palestine Liberation Organization, established in 1964, today administers the West Bank. Fatah and Hamas have different perspectives on how to resolve issues with Israel. But regardless, in effect, Israel continues to have overall formal control of both regions, policing the barbed wire enclosed borders of both territories, and as mentioned, creating and overseeing ever-worsening conditions for the Palestinians in both territories. The position of both Israel and Palestine is today extremely complicated, with few obvious options now apparent for resolution. Historically, Arab nations have refused to recognize or be at peace with Israel, demanding that Israel return all territory captured in the Six-Day War. That Israel recognize Palestine as a nation, with its capital at Jerusalem. And that Israel allow Palestinian refugees to return to the lands they lived on prior to Israel's occupation in 1948. In contrast, Israel says it cannot withdraw from all of the disputed territories because it has faced too many threats over the years from within them. They have, at different times, held different positions on Palestinian statehood. But they believe that accepting Palestinian refugees as citizens would threaten their national identity and security, since Palestinian people would constitute a near majority of the population if they did so. And in the current climate, which we'll talk more about in a moment, Israelis' politics are becoming ever more radical. In the Arab world too, some of Palestine's natural allies have also become increasingly frustrated with Palestine's refusal to seek compromise and to attempt to find solutions to what has now, in effect, become a standoff. It is, however, important to note at this point that this is far from an equal fight. Israel today is a major military power. Palestine, by contrast, while continuing to demand its rights to governance, ownership and occupation of lands that have historically been theirs, have few resources remaining to them. Their economies and communities have faced dire conditions for decades now. Aid from neighboring countries has been cut significantly in recent years, and Palestinian groups, including Hamas, have a fraction of the military capability that Israel has. Where many around the world have also condemned Israel's actions towards Palestinian peoples, noting severe human rights abuses, breaches of international law in relation to the continued settlement of Palestinian lands, as well as war crimes and crimes against humanity. Israel continues on with impunity, without fear of repercussion for their actions, whether they be in breach of international law or otherwise. Whatever the rights or wrongs of the situation, whoever the good guys or bad guys may be, the story of David and Goliath nonetheless comes to mind. This is not an equal fight. The most recent conflict began in the lead-up to 10th of May this year. 6 Palestinian families faced eviction from the houses where they had been living since the 1950s. This sparked clashes between Palestinians and Israeli security forces around the neighborhood, then leading to greater violence spreading to other parts of the city and triggers several riots. Clashes then broke out at Al-Aqsa Mosque, one of Islam's most sacred sites. Israeli soldiers entered and occupied the mosque, and Hamas sent an ultimatum threatening to attack if Israeli forces did not withdraw. Israel ignored the request, and on 10th of May Hamas, and a related Palestinian group, began firing rockets into Israel from the Gaza Strip. Notably, this also all occurred during Ramadan, the most holy of months for Muslim people. Israel have since utilized intensive airstrikes and demolished infrastructure, including buildings, schools, healthcare centers, and facilities housing refugees. Over just a few days, Israel also demolished the buildings that house more than 30 different media groups, including a building which housed 2 big international media organizations, the Associated Press and Al Jazeera. The current leader of Israel, President Netanyahu, is unrepentant about these events. He says they are necessary to protect Israel. Even the United States, Israel's traditional ally, has expressed concern over the actions taken, though, with President Biden joining calls for a ceasefire, one that did occur on 21st of May. But it's not clear when or how this conflict will formally come to an end, either in the short term or over the longer. Permanent peace solutions are needed, including a stop to Israelis' continued settlements in Palestinian lands. Condemnation of Israel's breaches of international law is needed. Whatever the merits of their claims to security and the need for a homeland, Israel's actions towards Palestine have been in breach of international law. And as mentioned, this is not a fair fight. Israel is a nation-state with enormous military, economic and political force in the world. Palestine is a nation of peoples and an occupied state, one that is not even recognized by many countries around the world, and one without the resources needed to ensure the well-being of their people. After fighting for more than 70 years, it is clear that this is not an issue that Israel and Palestine can solve alone. The situation has only escalated. Severe breaches of international law continue with impunity. And it's clear that the international community needs to step in and do more.